today's episode, we're going to explore the true purpose of preschool and what options are available to parents. Now, it's no secret that the need for free preschool is growing at an alarming rate in the US as the disparity between those living below the poverty line and those that aren't has increased from a gap to the Grand Canyon. So that's why I invited today's guest to join us. He's an internationally acclaimed speaker and best-selling author of 15 books. He's affectionately known as Jim Carrey with a PhD. And I first met him when I was on the educational conference speaking circuit. He is not afraid to tackle the tough topics, but he always does so with the quick wit of a stand-up comedian. You never know what's going to come out of his mouth, but it's almost always guaranteed to be funny. It's my good friend, Dr. Danny Brassell. He's the author of The Reading Breakthrough, the ultimate system for helping children love reading, and The Reading Makeover, based on his popular TEDx talk. Danny, first of all, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Vanessa. Thanks for all that you do to inspire not just pre-K teachers, but all the parents out there. I love it.
Well, we are super excited to chat with you here on the podcast because you have a lot of experience in the world of education. I think, didn't you used to teach kindergarten?
I've taught kindergarten, I've taught preschool. My dissertation for 5 years was working in South Central LA with homeless Latino preschoolers. That was my dissertation. I love those ones.
That's awesome. We're so excited to talk with other like-minded individuals, people who are all about elevating the field of early childhood, advocating for children, and you certainly fit that bill with all the work that you've done over the years. Today, I wanted to bring you on to talk a little bit about this confusing world. Well, we live in a confusing world right now, but in general terms about preschool and pre-K, it can also be confusing for a lot of folks, especially parents, right? Like people that don't have children aren't out there going, I wonder what the state of preschool education in the United States is all about. But all of a sudden they have a kid and they're like, whoa, I better learn this stuff. Like, where do I go? And it's so confusing to them. And I was just telling folks that, I talked to well-educated, wealthy tech guy the other day who all of a sudden has a 3-year-old. And he's like, what do I do? Where do I go? I'm like, okay, this is the same question that everyone asks regardless of their personal situation, their income, their education. Like nobody knows, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about what options are out there and maybe what the purpose of going to preschool or pre-K is, because I'm not sure that everyone is 100% clear on that. And I'm not sure that we are, but we could at least give some direction, right?
Well, and I think that's the problem, Vanessa. You and I are both parents. And I feel there's nothing worse than you're at a party and somebody's bragging that their 3-year-old is now composing symphonies. And I'm like, well, my son has learned how to pick his nose with 2 fingers at the same time. And you just start to stress, am I screwing up as a parent? And I want all parents to understand you're okay. Your kid's going to be all right. When I used to teach kindergarten, I used to tell my little ones, I'm like, I hope to God this isn't the best year of your life. I hope it's next year and the year after that. The windshield's a whole lot bigger than the rear view mirror. I mean, I have friends from high school that still talk about when we played high school football together. I'm like, my gosh, like stop living in the past. Let's live for the present and the future. So, parents freak out. And just because a kid is great in kindergarten, I've seen plenty of kindergartners that are my top kindergartners that are dealing drugs by the time they're in middle school. I've seen plenty of little ones that are sitting there eating paste in the back that turn out to graduate valedictorian. It's not how you start, it's how you finish. So I'm here to reassure parents, your kid is going to be all right, that you as a parent are your child's greatest teacher. And that's the most important thing to consider every day.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that is confusing to people, or at least the questions that I get in regards to preschool, right? When parents ask me this question, how do I know where to send my child to preschool? I've got 4 preschools down the street. I've got my public school in my neighborhood has a pre-K program. My church has one. Like, how do I know where to send my kid? And my answer is always, well, where you feel most comfortable sending your child. But then the question that they respond back to me is, well, Yeah, but how do I know that that's the right choice? Like, how do I know I'm making the right choice? It depends on your child's needs, right? Does your child love reading and love school, love learning, or do they just want to play all day, right? So we have to think about the needs of the child. And what do you think about that, Danny?
Well, I agree with you. We definitely, every kid's different. I mean, when I used to teach my kindergarten, I had 43 in my AM and 48 in my PM. And since I was a dude, they gave me all boys. This is when I started drinking. And it is interesting how life is all about stages. There was one point in my life where I could tell you where every bar was. Then there was a point in my life where I could tell you where every preschool is. And pretty soon I'll be able to tell you where every hair replacement center is. The big thing I try to tell parents is to calm down. Don't worry about it. I personally don't like preschools that deal with academics whatsoever. I think kids need a chance to play in the mud and stare at ants and just enjoy life. And that's to me is the purpose of preschool is really to give kids a little bit of a routine and to introduce them with other children and introduce them to the format of a school. But I've never had a preschooler come back and say, "Oh, Mr. Brassell, I'm really glad you got me up to the next quartile in my standardized testing." No, they're like, "Oh, I remember we used to make cupcakes together, and we used to go to the park, and you used to read aloud funny stories with funny voices. That's what we're supposed to be doing." And it's really what good parenting is about. Also, I think it was Jesse Jackson of all people who said, "Children don't need our presence; they need our presence." And I
Right.
completely agree with that. Is that time spent with a child is time well spent.
When you were talking, it reminded me of my nephew. I talk about him a lot here on the show. But his parents, even though I am I'm his aunt, that doesn't mean I'm his parent, right? So his parents have had to navigate these waters and either listen to or ignore my advice. We won't talk about which would they do more of, but in his case, he is a very what we call active boy. Danny, have you ever had any of those in your classroom before?
I was that boy. Yeah.
Exactly. He's
When I
a
was a kid,
very
when I was a kid, it was called curiosity. Now it's called attention deficit disorder.
right. Yeah. So that's him. And when it came time to choose preschools, of course, this was when the pandemic hit, so that it never really ended up happening for very long, but they knew right off that sitting and listening and getting and all of that kind of stuff wasn't going to work for their child. He's extremely bright,
Hmm.
but that type of setting was not going to be where he thrived. And so they searched and searched for like a kind of an outdoor nature based because he would really excel at that.
Right.
And I think that is an example of knowing your own child, right? Now, they could have said, I need to find a place that's going to teach him the letters, the numbers, the colors, the shapes, And first of all, he already knew all that stuff just because he was their kid, right? They chose instead to look for that. No.
Good
Oh,
parents. That's right. I mean, I always tell my kids if you go through life trying to be just like everybody else, that's exactly what you're going to be, like everybody else. Like
exactly.
we should be encouraging kids to be unique.
Right. And so, following their lead a little bit, but also not stressing about the academics. I think that's what a lot of parents tend to do. And this gentleman I was talking with recently who had a 3-year-old daughter, he was very concerned about her literacy levels at the age of 3. Right? I was trying to put his mind at ease that she indeed will be fine. He wasn't worried that she was behind, but he wanted her to be challenged or more invested in her learning somehow. I don't know, but I was
Well,
like,
I always there's that quote from Emil Buckwald that said, "Children are made readers in the laps of their parents," and that's what if you really want if you're concerned about the literacy of your little one, your 3-year-old, you should be reading aloud as often as possible to your child and giving them that exposure. There's so many. I mean, I don't need to be the person pushes this. One of my friends and mentors, Jim Trelease, he wrote the definitive book on the subject, the Read Aloud Handbook. And I encourage every parent and teacher in the world to go out and grab that book. The first half of the book gives you all the research on why reading aloud is the single best way you can improve a child's literacy skills. And then the second half of the book goes grade level by grade level recommendations and summaries of the best books to read aloud to kids. I mean, the great thing about this is what kind of broke my heart, Vanessa. I mean, I've taught all age levels, and my kindergartners would go to bed with their backpacks on, and my eighth graders were thinking of ways to get sick. And I'm like, what happened in those 8 years to get that kid to hate school so much? And I just love that your nephew, put him in a program where he's out in nature. And I mean, my goodness, if we're going to label people, they're going to start delivering standardized tests to children in the womb. It's ridiculous. And it means nothing. Those tests, is that a criteria for becoming a CEO of Coca-Cola or the president of the United States or a Major League Baseball commissioner? I mean, no, not at all. Matter of fact, you see a lot of the most successful people. I read biographies all the time, and I always point out to people, the one common element in most biographies is that these people dropped out of school. I'm like, what's that say about our school system? We need to do better. And the reason it's tough for us as educators is because we're trying to create a program that meets the needs of 36 kids at the same time. But we forget about the fact that all 36 of those kids are snowflakes. They're all very different. They're all motivated. What works with this little boy doesn't necessarily work with this little girl. I mean, when I was teaching little ones, I was insulted to be a male because I'm like, man, girls are so far ahead of boys at a young age. I mean, the boys hopefully catch up eventually by middle school, but I always thought the girls were brilliant and coordinated and the little boys were goofy and couldn't stand up straight. And it was fascinating. And then just watching like the differences in kids in how they interact and what turns them on. And so, I mean, as a parent, I wouldn't worry about those things. I'd embrace those things. That's what makes your kid unique.
Well, first of all, Danny, I have to fangirl a little bit because when I was doing a little bit of research for this podcast, now you and I have chatted and worked together before, but I was looking for your latest book because I always want to let people know about my guests' latest projects. And I saw that one of your recent books had a foreword by Jim Trelease. Yeah. And I fangirled so hard because one of the pinnacles of my career has been interviewing Jim Trelease back in just before his last edition of the Read Aloud Handbook, before it got taken over and he retired. And so anybody out there hasn't read Jim's book, the Read Aloud Handbook, so good. Your book is good as well, but isn't he just a phenomenal person?
He's probably the best education speaker I've ever seen, Vanessa. I mean, and I feel like a Baptist whenever I'm in his audience saying amen to everything. We overcomplicate way too much. And if there's one thing I want parents to get out of this podcast is that it doesn't have to be that tricky. I mean, my online reading engagement program, the reason I created it was because I think schools do an adequate job of teaching kids how to read, but what good is it teaching a kid how to read if they never want to read? I teach kids why to read because I've never had to tell a kid, go watch TV. I've never had to tell a kid, go play a video game. And I never want to have to tell a kid, go read a book. I want them to choose to do it on their own. And so that's what I love doing, is working with parents and teachers, giving them practical tips on how to get kids excited about reading, because the more excited you are to read, the more likely you are to read, and the more you read, the better you get. This does not have to be too difficult, and it doesn't have to be too stressful, and it doesn't have to be too expensive either.
Earlier, you said something about how kindergartners go to bed with their backpacks on, and the eighth graders are trying to think of ways to call out sick, if you will. And I think that is so, so true. Certainly of my own school experience as a child, I remember being excited about going to kindergarten and loathing every single minute of grades 6 through 12. Mm-hmm. And I often wonder, what is it that we're doing, right? And I don't know if it's we as a collective or as teachers or what, but what's happening in the interim to make kids not like school, and in particular, not like reading, because I feel like, and I don't know about you, Danny, but I feel like one of my number one jobs as an early childhood teacher was to get my kids to love reading, not so much to get them to read. Mm-hmm. the actual physical act, but to love reading, because I think that that is the biggest part of the battle. What do you think?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Vanessa. I mean, that's what I used to do with my preschoolers is I always made reading the reward. I'm like, hey, if we get this done, I'll do an extra read aloud. The kids were always excited because when I do read alouds, I'll be like, hey, I'm going to get Australian Pete to come read to us. And I'm like, g'day, mate, just got done putting a shrimp on the barbie. Your teacher said you want me to read to you. Kids like, yay, it's Australian Pete. It's me. Late in the afternoon, I'd become grumpy old man. Kids, shut up. I'm going to read to you. Kids like, yay, it's grumpy old man. That one got me in trouble once. The parents like, did some mean old guy tell my kid to be quiet? I'm like, oh, I won't invite him back to the class. But I completely agree. I think in my own personal observations, I think what happens is we go from wonderful preschool educators like you, Vanessa, getting kids excited about reading to them a variety of really cool picture books and things like that. And then all of a sudden in middle school and high school, I mean, in high school, I remember I was forced to read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, which is the story of Hester Prynne commits adultery and she's forced to wear an A on her chest for adultery. And I asked my teacher if I could wear a B on my chest because I was so bored reading that book. And she was doing everything she could to get me to hate reading. And I'm like, this is the problem. The research is very clear on this. It doesn't matter what you read. What matters is how much you read. It doesn't matter if you're reading James Joyce or James and the Giant Peach. People who read more read better. I always tell parents the little boy who reads Captain Underpants is going to be a better reader than the little boy who doesn't read anything. Captain Underpants is the gateway drug to Shakespeare, but we got to get that kid hooked on it first. There's a great scene in one of the Diary of the Wimpy Kid books where the mom wants to create a mother-son book club, and she invites all the neighborhood boys to bring books. And so the mother has brought Sarah Plain and Tall and Anne of Green Gables, and Little House on the Prairie, and Little Women. And the boys have brought like dinosaur books, how to cheat at video games, the book of bodily functions. That's what they're interested in. When I was a preschool teacher, telling the parents to do is a lot of people, it's kind of odd. People don't realize this, but writing actually precedes reading. You'll see kids writing, the little ones. And when I say writing, they're scribbling, they're drawing pictures. Eventually pictures turn into maybe a letter. And then letters, they start to understand that the sounds have something to do with it. So then you start seeing some sounds, whatever. Then eventually they're writing in a conventional manner. But I used to always encourage the parents to let their kids write books. They could write books together as a family or whatever. And of course, preschoolers, I mean, unless they're very advanced, I don't know many preschoolers that can read in a conventional manner. But a lot of them, they start to memorize. That's why every parent, I'll give you my oldest daughter, Kate. She used to read, she loved this book called Balto about this stupid wolf dog up in Alaska. A lot of people are like, I like Balto. I'm like, yeah, read it 875 times. We'll see how much you like Balto. And every night she'd be like, what's going to happen next? I'm like, I don't know. But this is our job as parents. We need to be the encouragers. We need to build up the confidence. When I do a parent seminar and the parents ask me, what can I do with my kid? I'm like, the fact that you're here already tells me 80% of what I need to know. The other 20% we can work on. Like if a person's listening to this podcast right now, this isn't the person I have to help. It's the person that's not listening to the podcast that needs the help. If you're listening, I can tell you right now with a high degree of certainty that your kid's going to be all right.
That's what I tell teachers who are in our Trailblazer mentorship program. Just the fact that you're there shows me that you're a dedicated, passionate teacher who's willing to go that extra mile. I mean, that is what it's all about. But Danny, one of the things I get asked that we haven't touched on yet is like, so what's the difference between like your public school pre-K program and the preschool down the street? And my pat answer to that, and I don't know if it's the best answer or not, is that the public programs, whether you call it universal pre-K, VPK, whatever you want to call it, wherever you're from, those are helping level the playing field, right? The private preschools, the ones that are for profit or even for nonprofit, but they are there for anyone who wants them. I think going back to that, we were talking about history a little bit earlier, and the history is, of this is that there will always be people who want to send their child to a private school for many, many, many different reasons, right? It could be because that private school is faith-based. It could be because that private school has a program that they really want their child to be in, right? Like a arts program or a science program. There's always going to be private schools. I think that they're never going to go away, or even charter schools. But the public programs that are offered for free help level the playing field, because not everyone can afford it. And as we know in our country, this disparity is getting greater and greater. And so the need for those public programs is growing and growing, right? What do you think?
I really like the way you explained that, Vanessa. The worst type of parent that gets their kid into a private school, the reason they're doing it is for their own personal prestige that their kid is going to that school. Different strokes for different folks. I mean, the reason that it's so vital that we offer universal pre-K for the little ones is there's been a lot of research on this that kids enter school at different levels. You'll find like this high income kid enters here and this low income kid enters here. And so basically that learning gap was created before the school ever had a chance at this kid. I've
Right.
seen this time and time and again. People can say whatever they want. The research is pretty clear. It's based on your income status.
Mhm.
A parent, I've worked with intoxicated parents. I've worked with incarcerated parents, but I've never worked with a parent that doesn't love hearing me tell them nice things about their kid.
Yeah.
And there's some parents that have to work 3 jobs to make ends meet.
Mhm.
It's not that they don't care about their kid, they just have a lot on their plate. Obviously, you got to choose. I was kicked out of so many schools as a kid. They say really bad students make really good teachers. And my mom tells me that I went to a Montessori school for one day and all I did was polish silverware. And my mom's like, he can do that at home for free. So she took me out of the Montessori. But I mean, I've gone to lots of Montessori schools. I always try to pick out, as a parent, you have a right to go sit in on classes. I think you should sit in on classes, see what you like. I mean, you and I know that so much of it just depends on the teacher. You give me a kind teacher, and that makes the total difference. I mean, I used to look at my colleagues. I'm like, why are my students so hyperactive? It's because I'm hyperactive. And I remember when I was in fourth grade, I had a teacher. She was about 183 years old, and after lunch, she would sit down in her chair. She'd get a book to read. She'd open it. She'd smile at us, and she'd say, "Come to my reading garden." And we all came to the reading garden. And that year, I realized all of us were so kind and gentle with one another. It's because our teacher was kind and gentle. I mean, kids just mimic whatever they're seeing. And so, again, like private versus public versus charter, people always ask me, which one would you choose? I'm like, yes, different strokes for different folks. I mean,
Right.
every kid's a little bit different. I mean, I've seen schools, and there's no one that's better than another, by the way. I've seen
Right.
lots of successful public schools. I've seen lots of horrible public schools. And I would make that same argument for magnet schools, for charter schools, for private schools. It just depends. And even within the same school, you could have a great school and there's a really bad teacher in this classroom. I see that all the time. And you could be
Yeah.
in the worst school and there's a teacher that I would do whatever it took to get my kid in that classroom. That's a great teacher. So as a parent, you have a right to actually sit in on classes and if nothing else, volunteer and help the teacher. Every teacher, I've never seen a teacher deny a person from volunteering in their classroom, but you have that right, and I think that's really important. It's whatever you feel. I mean, I have 3 kids of my own, and all 3 of my kids are very different, and they've had different schools. Always, I'm a big believer in public schools, but it's ironic that all 3 of my kids are in charter schools right now. It's
Right.
fascinating to me. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And I love the charter schools that they're in,
Right.
and the public schools that I thought were going to be great in my area aren't so great. And so that's why I put them in the charter schools is there's more individualized attention and the kids are flourishing rather than being just a small fish in a big pond. But that, I mean, I went to I totally bombed. I was kicked out of so many private schools. And then I eventually flourished in a public school.
Right.
That's probably why I became such an advocate for public school, but that was my experience. Everybody's experience is a little bit different.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny when you were saying that, you were saying, why is my class so hyper? And you were the hyper one. People would come into my classroom and say, why is your class so calm? Are you giving them something? And it's because I was very calm. They pick up, they're very intuitive little beings, right? I mean, they pick up on this stuff. And going back to the whole universal pre-K or VPK, whatever you want to call it, versus private schools. I don't like to use the word versus because that makes it sound like they're competing against each other, and they're not, because they both serve a separate audience, right? Because if you can afford a private preschool, then you have the absolute choice, right, to do that. There is nobody out there saying don't send your child to a private or for-profit or even a nonprofit preschool. But the public pre-kindergarten program serves a different crowd. And those are the folks who, like you said, might be working 3 different jobs just to keep a roof over their head. They don't have access, right? Some of them live in food deserts. Some of them live in places where there's no books. Book deserts exist. They can't get a library card because they're working 3 jobs, or their address changes so much, or for many different reasons. So those programs exist to serve children who need that extra boost. And in a perfect world, we would have our absolute best teachers teaching those programs, right? But we don't live in a perfect world. But we can, of course, try our very best to help all students that are in our classrooms, regardless of what setting we're in, right? We all want to do what's, just like you said, all parents want what's best for their children, or all parents, want their children to read. I think all teachers want their students to succeed, regardless of what setting they're in. I don't know. What do you think?
It's all proper psychology. I mean, I always tell my students sometimes you need somebody else to believe in you before you believe in yourself. They only give me the best and the brightest, and that's why I believe in all of you. You start telling a kid that enough. I was very blessed, Vanessa. I grew up in a very positive environment. My wife grew up in the most negative environment with people telling her what she couldn't do all the time. I have a photograph of me when I was 4 years old wearing space boots, a San Diego Charger football jersey, a sheriff's badge, and a fireman's helmet, because I was going to be the first ever astronaut, professional football player, police officer, and firefighter. I mean, that's the world I grew up in. And I want every kid to grow up in a world where they believe that they have the opportunity to succeed in whatever they want. To me, it's so much as just psychology. And I've always asked, as a teacher, I've always asked for the problem students, because I want to be Ellis Island. And I think that there's this great book. A lot of people think it's good. I think it's great. It says you should try and treat other people the way you want to be treated. I find when I treat people like they're geniuses, they start acting like they're geniuses. And they'll give me all kinds of special needs students. And I always tell people, well, every kid has special needs. And on the very first day of school, I always say, you guys got to help me out. This is my first time teaching in the Gifted and Talented program. And they look at one another, and I'm like, no, they rise or fall based on the expectation. Even as a parent, you can ask your kid, are you going to college? Or you can ask your kid, which college are you going to? Those are fundamentally 2 very different questions. I mean, my mom and dad never asked my brother, sister, and me if we were going to college. They asked how high of a degree we were getting.
Right.
And that's a very different expectation. And I just believe that so much of this is just psychology. Same thing when people are mean in front of me. I say, no, that's not the way we speak here. Don't let it be acceptable. That's why I stopped watching the news and watching a lot of the media. I'm like, no, I don't accept people. I had a 2nd grade nun before I was kicked out of that school. She said something once to me, which always stuck, because I was yelling at a kid, and she says, you must be losing your argument. Only people that yell are losing their argument. I always remembered that. It's funny the things that you remember, but she was really about kindness. And I'm like, you know what? That's Clifton Fadiman said there's plenty of smarter people in the world. What the world needs is better people. And that's the reason I became an educator, is I wanted to help create better people.
Excellent. I love it. Danny, you're always so fun to talk to. I know that our listeners and viewers are going to want to know what you're up to. I know we talked a little bit about your books and what you've been up to, but let us know if we can continue the conversation with you somewhere, or what books you're promoting right now. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to serve you and your audience, Vanessa. And first of all, thank you for doing this. I mean, I think people need to be inspired by programs like this one. So if you go to freereadingtraining.com, Again, freereadingtraining.com. I'm going to give everybody a complimentary e-copy of one of my books called Read, Lead, and Succeed. This is a book, I wrote it for a school principal who was trying to keep his faculty positively engaged. So I said, okay, I'll write you a book. So every week I give you a concept, an inspirational quote, an inspirational story, a book recommendation on a book you should read, but you're probably too lazy because you're an adult. So I also give you a children's picture book recommendation that demonstrates the same concept in 5 minutes. Plus, I'm going to give you access to one of the reading challenges I recently did with parents, where every day for 5 days in a row, I'll give you an hour of a whole bunch of ideas based on my reading engagement program to get your kid excited to read. Because again, the more excited you are to read, the more likely you are to read. The more you read, the better you get. We're going to get kids to read more, read better, and most importantly, to love reading. So thanks for all that you do, Vanessa, and thanks to your audience for giving me some time to listen to me.
Yes, thank you so much, Danny. It's always a pleasure. And until next time, I'm Vanessa Levin, and this is Danny Brassell. Onward and upward.